Jasmine Crockett walked onto the View expecting a civil debate, but within 4 minutes, she was ambushed, mocked, and humiliated on live TV by Joy Behar and her co-hosts in front of 3 million Americans. What they didn't know was that every smirk, every insult, every scripted jab had been secretly documented, and 1 week later, an $800 million lawsuit would tear the curtain down on ABC's most protected empire. As advertisers flee and reputations crumble, Jasmine doesn't ask for revenge. She demands respect. A talk show becomes a courtroom. A smear becomes a scandal. And a setup becomes the most expensive mistake in daytime television history. How far did they go to break her? And why did they think she'd stay silent? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The overhead lights on the set of The View weren't just bright. They were clinical, almost surgical, as if designed to expose any flicker of vulnerability. Jasmine Crockett knew this wasn't just another guest appearance. It was a test, and not the kind she hadn't passed before. Dressed in a deep emerald suit that caught the light just enough to reflect strength without vanity, she sat with both feet flat on the floor, hands folded neatly in her lap. The camera panned. Polite applause rose from the audience, but behind the glass, the energy in the control booth was different, edgy, expectant. Producers leaned in close to their monitors. Someone whispered into a headset, "Stand by for segment 3. This is the one." Jasmine could feel it, not the anticipation of dialogue, but the quiet sharpening of knives. She had come to speak about policies that mattered: economic disenfranchisement in urban communities, healthcare deserts in rural counties, the deep racial disparities in maternal mortality. Instead, she was greeted with a smile edged in steel from Joy Behar, who turned ever so slightly in her chair, adjusting her posture like a veteran ready to pounce. Jasmine had barely finished her opening sentence. Something about the structural failures of post-pandemic economic recovery, when Joy cut in, laughter lurking in her tone. "Let's be honest here," Joy said, loud enough for the crowd to perk up. "Jasmine's got that good TV look. That's probably why she's here, right? I mean, no offense. But let's not pretend Trump was scouting for scholars." The audience chuckled, hesitant, unsure whether to laugh or brace. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they know they're not the one who should feel embarrassed. But the moment wasn't over. Sunny Hostin leaned in next, her voice softer but colder, calculated. "I just think we need to be honest about what's happening here," she said, directing her words not to Jasmine, but to the audience. "This isn't about policy, it's about packaging. Jasmine fits the moment. Young, black, camera-ready. And that's fine. But let's not act like this is about qualifications. It's branding." There it was. The room didn't erupt. It sank. You could feel it. The air tighten, the invisible cord that holds civility in place suddenly straining. Jasmine sat upright, unmoving, but her eyes darkened. Her credentials were extensive. A law degree earned through years of sacrifice, a legislative record that spoke louder than any soundbite, and a career built not on image, but impact. But in less than 2 minutes, her life's work had been flattened into a stereotype, an accessory for political optics. The real blow came from Whoopi Goldberg. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. She crossed her arms slowly, leaned back in her chair like a judge, and said, "Let's just say what everyone's thinking. If it weren't for diversity initiatives, Jasmine wouldn't even be at this table. That's the truth." Silence. Not the kind that falls, but the kind that detonates. Even the audience, conditioned to clap and laugh on cue, hesitated. No cue card could fix that. The comment wasn't hidden behind innuendo. It was direct, flat, and devastating. It didn't question Jasmine's argument. It erased her right to have one. It didn't push back on her position. It delegitimized her entire presence. The implication was clear. Jasmine Crockett wasn't here because she earned it. She was here because someone needed a black woman to check a box. Jasmine inhaled slowly. The camera zoomed in. Sweat glistened faintly on her forehead, not from fear, but from the weight of self-restraint. She glanced at Whoopi, not with hostility, but with something sharper: clarity. That single sentence from Whoopi didn't just undermine Jasmine. It undermined every woman of color who had ever walked into a space with more intelligence than welcome. It was betrayal disguised as commentary. What millions of viewers thought ended as just another tense moment on television was, for Jasmine Crockett, the beginning of something much colder, much sharper, and entirely intentional. She didn't storm off the set. She didn't cry. She didn't even look back as she passed the snack table, the fake smiles or the posters on the wall claiming the view was honest conversation. Jasmine had already understood the truth. She hadn't been invited for a respectful discussion. She'd been brought in as a punching bag, but they had made one huge mistake. They picked the wrong woman. She walked down the hallway with calm steps, her heels clicking like a clock, ticking down to something serious. No one spoke to her. No one said goodbye. When she reached the elevator, she took out her phone, found one name in her contacts, and hit call. She spoke only 3 words. "We're doing this." That night, when Jasmine got back to her apartment, her legal team was already getting to work. These weren't press people or campaign workers. These were real lawyers, serious ones, who had worked on big national cases before. They didn't ask her how she felt. They asked her to describe what happened. What exactly was said? Who laughed? Did anyone behind the scenes encourage it? Jasmine answered everything calmly, clearly. She didn't need to look at notes. She remembered it all. And now every word, every look, every camera angle was about to be studied. They broke the video of the show down second by second. They looked at behind-the-scenes clips from the cameras that kept rolling during commercial breaks. One of her staff members had already asked for those copies, using a routine request meant for official records. The lawyers slowed the video, analyzed each host's expression, and noticed how the laughter was timed perfectly. Then came the shocking part, the messages between people working on the show. One message, sent just before Jasmine appeared, said, "Joy starts with something about her looks. Sunny will talk about privilege. Whoopi finishes strong. She knows what to say." That wasn't just a bad interview. That was a plan. 1 week after the show aired, at 9 o'clock in the morning, a man in a suit delivered a black envelope to the main office of the television network. Inside was a letter that said Jasmine was preparing to sue the company and the host for trying to damage her name and career on purpose. The letter included nearly 50 pages of proof, videos, emails, and even screenshots of private conversations from people who worked on the show. There was also a memory stick with everything organized and labeled. On the front page, one sentence stood out. "This is not about feelings. This is about showing the world what happens when powerful people humiliate others and hide behind the word entertainment." At the TV station, everything went silent. The top lawyers read the letter and said, "We're in trouble." It wasn't just a threat, it was real, and it was strong. Each point came with clear evidence. One lawyer whispered, "How did we not see this coming?" Another staff member admitted quietly, "Because we thought she'd do what the others did, stay quiet." But Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to stay quiet. The amount she asked for was huge, $800 million. That wasn't just a random number. That was how much the show was expected to earn over the next few years, multiplied to make a statement. She wasn't just asking for money. She was demanding change. Jasmine and her lawyers didn't just want to win. They wanted to show that you can't publicly attack someone's worth and walk away without consequences. Inside the building, panic spread. Producers were pulled from meetings. Hosts were told to stop interviews. One person even locked themselves in their dressing room. A junior assistant asked, "Can't we just apologize?" But the lead lawyer shook his head and said, "You can't apologize for something you planned in advance. This will go to court." Back at home, Jasmine sat at her desk, surrounded by papers. Her apartment was quiet, no TV, no noise. On her walls were pictures from her work in Congress, thank you letters from people she helped, and awards for her efforts to fight injustice. They tried to reduce her to a joke on live TV. They forgot she had spent years fighting harder battles in rooms where no one clapped. They mocked her career, but they were about to learn every detail of it in a courtroom where laughter wouldn't help them. Jasmine didn't raise her voice that day. She didn't fight back on camera, but with one phone call, one envelope, and 1 week of preparation, She turned a public attack into a legal firestorm. And for the first time in a long time, a national talk show was about to learn what real accountability looked like. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't stepping into that courtroom with just a hurt reputation. She was walking in armed with evidence so precise, so cold, it would leave no room for excuses, no cracks for sympathy, and no place for the guilty to hide. Her legal team didn't just come with paperwork, they came with a digital arsenal. The first blow was footage never meant for public eyes, behind-the-scenes video taken from the studio's secondary cameras, the ones that stay rolling between commercial breaks. In those off-air moments, smiles faded and real intentions surfaced. A floor manager was seen whispering, "She's stiff. Keep the pressure on," as a producer off-camera gave a thumbs up right after Whoopi's brutal diversity comment landed. The footage showed laughter that wasn't spontaneous. It was cued. Signals exchanged between crew members were clear, timed, and disturbing. In one clip, a camera operator chuckled and muttered, "This'll trend by noon," as Jasmine sat frozen, composed, unknowingly in the middle of a setup. The courtroom fell still as the video played, not like a montage, but like a confession. Then came the messages, internal, time-stamped, undeniable. Slack logs from the show's planning team were retrieved, authenticated, and enlarged for everyone in the room to see. One message read, "Let joy open with the appearance jab. She'll get the audience giggling. Sunny takes it to privilege. Whoopi brings the hammer down." It was written casually, as if lining up ingredients for a recipe. There was no debate, no concern, no hesitation. They didn't just plan to challenge Jasmine. They choreographed her humiliation with military-like precision. The texts were read aloud by Jasmine's lead attorney, each sentence striking like a gavel against the floor of the courtroom. A juror covered their mouth. Another leaned back, arms crossed tightly, eyes locked on the hosts. There was no misinterpreting these messages. They weren't opinion. They were intent. But it didn't stop there. The next piece of evidence came from a producer's notebook, pages recovered from a scanned copy saved in the studio's scheduling software. It wasn't labeled maliciously, just segment strategy, Representative Crockett. But the content was damning. Bullet points spelled it out like a script. Start light, shift tone by minute 4, challenge her credibility, make her defensive, break her rhythm, break her spirit. One line had been circled twice in red ink. Break her spirit on camera. The courtroom, already tense, now felt like it was holding its breath. That phrase didn't sound like television. It sounded like psychological warfare. Jasmine didn't flinch as the page was displayed. She had already lived it once. Now she was forcing them to watch it back. The final blow, the moment that seemed to shatter the last illusion of innocence, came through a short audio recording, raw, grainy, and unfiltered. A voice memo from the control room, captured by an assistant editor's phone, left recording by accident. The voice was unmistakable. A senior producer, laughing quietly. "She cracked. That's it. We got what we needed." There was no shock in the tone, no regret, just satisfaction. As if Jasmine's silence during the segment, her composed resistance, was the victory they had orchestrated. But now that very sentence echoed back across the courtroom like a weapon misfiring in the wrong hands. Jasmine sat through it all in silence. Not cold, but strong. Her expression was unreadable. Not detached, but unshakable. Across the aisle, the defendants looked smaller than they had on television. Less glamorous, more exposed. This wasn't a talk show anymore. It was a reckoning. And in this room, there were no commercial breaks, no canned applause, no producers to shout, "Cut," when things got too real. There was only evidence, and a woman they tried to destroy, now turning every cruel whisper, every laughing message, every gotcha moment into a nail in the coffin of their defense. With the courtroom silence still echoing from the last recording, "She cracked. We got what we needed." The air around Jasmine Crockett changed. The damage was now undeniable, and those who once laughed behind studio lights began looking for shadows to hide in. It began with a phone call Jasmine hadn't expected, not from a lawyer or journalist, but from a woman she deeply respected, someone older, grounded, and wise. someone who had mentored young activists across generations. Her voice on the other end was warm, hesitant, but unmistakably careful. "Jasmine," she said softly, "Whoopi wants to reach out, personally." Jasmine said nothing. The woman continued, "She doesn't want this to escalate. She believes that you two, as black women, can handle this the right way. No courtrooms, no headlines, just a real conversation, woman to woman." The message was dressed in kinship, draped in sisterhood, offered like an olive branch. But Jasmine knew better. It wasn't reconciliation, it was retreat. The same woman who had once looked her in the eye and said she didn't belong on that stage was now hoping shared skin color could erase shared harm. Jasmine stood at the window of her apartment, phone pressed to her ear, watching the city blur behind layers of glass and memory. Her voice, when it came, was low but certain, razor sharp through velvet. "Tell her this isn't about two women having a disagreement," she said. "This is about what she said with a microphone, a camera, and the full weight of a national platform." She paused, letting the words settle. "I wasn't wounded in private. I was humiliated in public." Her eyes didn't blink as she said it. There was no bitterness in her tone, only precision. She wasn't seeking vengeance. She was defending truth in the exact arena where it had been twisted. There could be no private closure when the harm had been nationally televised, rehearsed, and directed like theater. Then Jasmine added something the woman on the other end would never forget. "Tell Whoopi," she said, "if we were truly sisters, she wouldn't have sat beside me and struck the match." Silence lingered. A long breath passed through the line. Jasmine didn't wait for a response. She simply ended the call. The conversation, like the plea it carried, was over. What they had done to her wasn't a misstep or an awkward moment. It was a calculated betrayal delivered through smiles and applause, scripted down to the last beat. And now that truth was moving out of the shadows where it had been whispered and denied, into the light of testimony and consequence. Jasmine Crockett wasn't backing down. She was rising, on record in the open, and by her own name. But if Whoopi's appeal to sisterhood failed quietly behind the curtain, Joy Behar's move came wrapped in something far more calculated. Money, apology without admission, and the desperate hope that silence could be bought before truth reached a courtroom. The meeting was set in a private conference room at the Carlisle Hotel, one of those old Manhattan hideaways designed to whisper secrets between crystal glasses and silk drapes. Jasmine wasn't there. She didn't need to be. Her attorney, a woman as sharp as broken glass and twice as cold, arrived exactly on time, carrying a thin folder and nothing else. Joy Behar was already seated, flanked by two network representatives and an entertainment lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The mood was strained, as if everyone in the room knew they were there not to negotiate, but to plead. Joy, for once, wasn't performing. Her voice was low, her gestures small, her trademark sarcasm buried under a tight, forced smile. She opened by acknowledging that things got out of hand on set, that tensions were high, that maybe lines were crossed, but then pivoted swiftly to what she called a path to healing. It came in the form of a proposal, a discreet settlement, no courtroom, no admission of wrongdoing, and a carefully worded public statement expressing regret, but nothing more. The attorney listened without interrupting. No nods, no softening. When Joy finished, there was a brief silence, sharp and full of meaning. Then Jasmine's lawyer opened the folder and pulled out a single-page response, typed, signed, and ready. "Congresswoman Crockett has reviewed your offer," she said coolly, "and she declines." There was a visible shift in the room. Shoulders tensed, a pen dropped. Someone exhaled too loudly. The lawyer leaned forward, her voice now cutting clean through the quiet. "This is not about reputation. It's not about airtime or bad press. It's about dignity, publicly stripped, nationally televised, and deliberately engineered." She pushed the paper toward them like a final warning. "You can't bury humiliation with hush money, not this time." Back at her office, Jasmine read the summary of the meeting without a flicker of emotion. She had expected the attempt. What she didn't expect was how hollow it would feel. Joy Behar, who had mocked her face, her purpose, her presence, now wanted closure without consequences. Jasmine stood at her window, watching the city crawl beneath her. The world had always tried to make women like her choose between voice and peace, justice and survival. But this wasn't 1965. This wasn't a backroom deal made to protect legacy. This was her story, and she was no longer asking for space in it. She was taking it back. And while Joy tried to buy her way out with veiled regret and backroom settlements, Sunny Hostin, once the show's resident legal expert, was beginning to see the full legal noose tightening. And it wasn't just a bad look. It was personal liability. Sunny had built her career on credentials: a former federal prosecutor, a respected legal analyst, a woman who often reminded audiences she knew the law. But now that very knowledge was turning on her like a reflection she couldn't escape. As evidence mounted and Jasmine's legal filings grew heavier with detail, Sunny found herself in an unfamiliar position, not behind the commentary desk, but squarely in the line of legal fire. Her name was listed. Her voice was quoted. Her words, delivered with smug confidence just weeks earlier, were now being dissected, transcribed, and weaponized against her in real court, not the court of public opinion. The pressure broke through one evening when she sent a discreet email to Jasmine's legal team, bypassing her own network's lawyers. No signatures, no letterhead, just a message. If Congresswoman Crockett would consider withdrawing my name, I am willing to issue a public apology and step down from the show indefinitely. The email was delivered, read, and forwarded. Jasmine saw it just before midnight. She didn't answer immediately. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then pushed away from her desk and stood in the middle of her quiet apartment, letting the weight of Sunny's offer settle in. It wasn't fear that moved her. It was clarity. This wasn't just someone trying to escape consequences. It was someone hoping to be spared because they now understood the pain they helped cause. But Jasmine remembered the smirk, the dismissive tone, the sharp-edged words. Let's not pretend she's here for her qualifications. That moment hadn't been a slip. It had been surgical, intentional. She sat back down, opened a reply window, and typed just one line. The pain I felt wasn't selective. Neither is the justice I'm seeking. She didn't send a follow-up. She didn't elaborate. That sentence was her entire position, pure, unshakable, and final. There was no escape clause in the contract of accountability. Sunny had made her choice in front of millions. Now Jasmine was making hers, in front of history. Sunny's quiet plea had been rejected, Joy's private deal dismissed, and Whoopi's back-channel appeal ignored. So now the last refuge for The View wasn't charm or secrecy. It was the courtroom. And this time, the lights were real, the microphones unfiltered, and there was no script to hide behind. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan hadn't seen this much media traffic in years. Satellite trucks lined the block. News anchors in tailored suits jostled for space outside steel barricades. The trial of Crockett versus ABC in The View wasn't just news. It had become a national moment, broadcast live across all major networks. Inside, the tension felt like oxygen had been removed from the air. Reporters whispered into voice recorders. Every movement was tracked. And then the room shifted because Jasmine Crockett entered. She wasn't surrounded by a swarm of advisors, no entourage, no PR handler, just a single black briefcase in one hand and that unmistakable calm in her step, like a storm had chosen to walk instead of thunder. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Her presence alone rewrote the power dynamic the moment she passed through the courtroom doors. The hosts arrived later, ushered in through a side entrance, heads lowered beneath sunglasses far too large for the cloudy morning. They didn't speak to each other. They barely looked up. The confidence they had once worn, like armor on television, now sagged beneath wrinkled blazers and overnight eye bags. Whoopi kept her coat on, despite the warm courtroom air. Joy clutched a stack of notes that looked untouched. Sunny moved like someone walking through a dream they couldn't wake from. The contrast was unmistakable. Jasmine stood like she had nothing to prove, while the women who had mocked her on daytime television now sat at the defense table, flinching each time a new face in the jury box turned toward them. The courtroom, once a stage for their laughter, had become a mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped into the courtroom, the weight of silence wasn't just anticipation, it was judgment waiting to be unleashed. But she wasn't there to plead for sympathy. She was there to unveil what had always been hidden, the cold, deliberate truth behind her public takedown. The room dimmed slightly, not out of dramatics, but necessity. A large display monitor was wheeled into position before the jury, its screen black and humming. The lead prosecutor stepped forward, clicked a remote, and the first video loaded, unedited, unfiltered, untouched by studio hands. The footage began not with the broadcasted segment, but with the raw camera feeds taken from before they were chopped into consumable sound bites. The jury saw what no home viewer had ever seen. Jasmine seated under glaring lights, her hands folded tightly, waiting as the hosts adjusted their earpieces. Then, the choreography began. At the exact second Joy Behar launched her condescending joke about Jasmine's looks, a camera panned in close to catch her reaction. It wasn't random. It was timed. Another angle caught Whoopi nodding off-screen, just as Sunny's privilege comment dropped like a cold blade. But what made the footage unbearable wasn't the dialogue. It was the nonverbal coordination. Glances exchanged, tiny smirks, producers behind the cameras mouthing, "Good, good." It was the anatomy of humiliation, planned, precise, and predatory. Then the visual switched. Onto the screen appeared a full-screen image of a chat log, blown up in high resolution for every juror to see. Timestamps glowed in the corner. 8:42 a.m., just 2 hours before Jasmine's appearance. The message read, "We need a viral moment. Jasmine is today's target." The room didn't gasp. It held its breath. Jurors sat back. The court reporter stopped typing for a moment. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was a direct admission of purpose. Not debate, not dialogue. Targeting. The prosecution flipped to the next message. "Let Joy jab first. Let Sunny hit the privilege angle. Whoopi closes hard. Keep camera tight. Make it look organic." The message was written like a battle plan. And Jasmine, a sitting congresswoman, had been the prey. The prosecution moved slowly, giving the jury time to absorb the weight of every word. Then came the final blow, a voice memo, recorded accidentally on a junior editor's phone, left running in the control room. The room dimmed further as the sound echoed through high-fidelity speakers. The voice was unmistakable, male, smug, casual, like someone commenting on a halftime score. "She cracked. That's gold. Run with it." 3 sentences, enough to shift the courtroom from tense to volatile. It wasn't commentary. It was a declaration of victory over a woman they had spent hours preparing to emotionally corner. And they had done it so casually, so efficiently, that her pain had been reduced to a marketing opportunity. The lights rose slightly. No one moved. Jasmine sat still, eyes forward. She didn't cry. She didn't nod. Her face was steel. But across the room, the hosts who once held the upper hand were now reduced to still figures behind the defense table. Joy's hands gripped her wrist until her knuckles whitened. Whoopi stared at the table, unmoving. Sunny looked directly at the jury, but her expression was empty, unreadable. The prosecution didn't need a closing remark. The screens went dark. The evidence didn't require interpretation. It wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. And in that heavy silence, the courtroom no longer saw a guest who had overreacted. They saw a woman surgically dismantled for ratings, for attention, for control, and now finally rising in the very place designed to shame her. When the final clip cut to black and the courtroom remained suspended in breathless silence, there was nowhere left for the defense to run. And yet, despite the damning evidence, the digital trail, the smirks caught on camera, the lawyers for ABC stood up, straightened their jackets, and tried to rewrite the moment as mere misunderstanding. The lead attorney for ABC took a slow breath before approaching the center of the courtroom, walking as though the weight of the evidence behind him hadn't already darkened the room. He spoke softly at first, his voice tempered, every syllable calculated to sound reasonable, measured, not evasive. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, turning toward the jury with open, practiced hands, "what you've witnessed here, while uncomfortable, was never designed to hurt. This is the view. A talk show, live television, unscripted, dynamic, reactive by nature. His tone sought sympathy, a quiet pleading for perspective. This is entertainment, he added, pausing for effect. This is humorous discourse, not targeted attack. He turned back to the screen, now black and blank, as though its silence might help his argument. These are human beings. These are unscripted hosts reacting in real time. Comments may land poorly, but that does not make them weapons. Then he repeated it, slower, louder, as if willing it to be true. This is entertainment, not personal, not planned. But behind him, the shadows of every Slack message, every smirk, every voice memo still clung to the air, like a film of smoke after fire. The courtroom was still too thick with the weight of the phrase, "We need a viral moment. Jasmine is today's target." Then came the fallback strategy, hollow and trembling beneath its polished exterior. These comments were small mistakes made during the rush of a fast-paced, high-pressure environment, the lawyer insisted. In the world of daytime TV, missteps are inevitable. That does not make them criminal. That does not make them cruel. His voice faltered for just a beat, and the room heard it. A stutter, slight but audible, the sound of a defense unraveling beneath its own thin skin. But the damage had already been done, and no amount of carefully phrased excuses could unring what had already echoed across the nation. The jury didn't shift. The judge didn't interrupt. Jasmine didn't blink. Because calling it humor didn't make it funny. Calling it a small mistake didn't make it less deliberate. And calling it not personal didn't erase the target drawn clearly, coldly, and digitally around her name. The judge leaned forward slowly, folding his hands atop a thick, leather-bound folder lined with printed transcripts and time-stamped exhibits. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It sliced through the courtroom like cold steel. "Counselor," he said evenly, "you've explained what you think this wasn't. Now explain what this is." A pause, then he gestured to the clerk, who tapped a key and projected a Slack message onto the large monitor, the glowing letters impossible to ignore. "We need a viral moment. Jasmine is today's target." The words sat in the center of the screen like a bullet hole through glass. "Do you expect this court to believe," the judge continued, eyes narrowing, "that identifying a guest as a target before they've said a single word is just a byproduct of live television?" The attorney hesitated. The explanation was already dead before it reached his lips. "Because what I see," the judge pressed, turning a page in his binder, "is a coordinated directive from production leadership, not improvisation from a nervous host." The tone was still calm, but it dripped with the weight of restrained fury. He turned toward the jury, then back to the screen. Another document appeared, a chart showing recurring segment patterns involving conservative women. Names, dates, and quotes were neatly organized in rows. "3 different guests," the judge said flatly. 3 similar setups. Same treatment, same format, nearly identical language used by the hosts. Are those accidents too? The courtroom remained painfully still. At the defense table, a legal assistant looked down at her lap. One of the hosts shifted in her seat, lips pressed into a line so tight it nearly vanished. The illusion of spontaneity had cracked, and now the fragments were slicing into their credibility. Then came the moment that redefined the mood. A voice from the jury box spoke up, measured, low, but sharp enough to cut through the silence like a blade. It was juror number 6, a former school principal in his late 60s, who had remained quiet through the entire trial until now. He leaned slightly forward and asked, not with anger, but something colder, disappointment. "If this was a mistake, why does it read like a checklist?" The room absorbed the question like a body takes a blow. No one answered. The defense attorney looked as if he might speak but thought better of it. Even the judge didn't break the silence this time, because there was nothing left to say. It wasn't just one off-the-cuff comment anymore. It was a strategy. And the courtroom, once swayed by charisma and clever editing, now sat face-to-face with what had been engineered. A methodical plan to humiliate a guest under the guise of humor, executed with the precision of a media machine too used to immunity. The defense's final appeal to chaos as comedy hung awkwardly in the air, hoping to diffuse the calculated cruelty the jury had just witnessed. But the silence that followed wasn't one of understanding. It was one of disbelief. And the bench had heard enough. The defense had exhausted every justification, every loophole, every excuse dressed as explanation. The courtroom had witnessed not just a trial, but a reckoning. Now, as the jury returned, the air inside felt electric, charged with history, consequence, and the long-delayed weight of truth. The foreperson rose slowly, the paper in her hands trembling just enough to betray the gravity of what it carried. Every eye in the room locked on her. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the silence was so absolute it felt like the entire country was holding its breath in sync. Jasmine Crockett sat with a posture carved from stone, her hands folded, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed forward. She didn't flinch, didn't glance at her legal team, didn't look toward the defense table where the host sat in a half-collapsed row of carefully constructed silence. The judge nodded gently. The foreperson cleared her throat once. No performance, no excess, just the steady voice of someone about to read a verdict that would echo far beyond those four walls. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of defamation," she began, voice firm, words deliberate, "and of intentional harm to public reputation." The impact of those 15 words was seismic, not loud but total. It wasn't just a judgment. It was an indictment of a culture that had turned cruelty into programming and labeled it entertainment. You could feel the shift in the room, not a gasp, not even a murmur, just a palpable crack in the illusion of power that had surrounded the defendants until now. Joy Behar gripped the edge of the table as if anchoring herself to something real. Whoopi Goldberg stared at the jury with the frozen stillness of someone watching a house collapse in slow motion. Sunny Hostin closed her eyes just for a second, as if trying to disappear inside herself. Then came the final blow. Calm, clear, undeniable. "We award damages in the amount of $800 million. The words did not echo. They landed like stone on glass. A financial figure, yes. But more than that, a symbolic reckoning. It wasn't a number plucked from the sky. It was a direct measurement of harm, intention, scale, and national consequence. $800 million wasn't just a penalty. It was a signal flare to an entire industry that had long believed accountability did not apply to those behind the desk. There were no cheers, no applause, just the quiet devastation of reality settling in. And still Jasmine didn't move, because she didn't need to. Her composure had outlasted every smirk, every segment, every whispered plan. She had walked into that courtroom not just to defend her name, but to dismantle the assumption that voices like hers could be ridiculed without recourse. And now, in the stillness that followed the verdict, even the silence felt like it belonged to her. The verdict hadn't just closed a courtroom chapter, it opened a floodgate. And as the jury stood, and Jasmine Crockett remained motionless in silent defiance, the ripple began. But by the time it reached the studios of The View, it was no ripple at all. It was a tidal wave. Within hours of the verdict, ABC's upper floors were in chaos. Emergency emails flooded inboxes with subject lines in all caps. Crisis response needed, advertiser status update, shutdown discussion, urgent. The network's flagship morning program, The View, didn't air the next morning, nor the morning after that. No explanation was given to the public, no reruns, no guest hosts, not even a placeholder graphic. Just silence. A silence louder than any opening monologue the show had ever delivered. Inside the building, the order had already been issued. Indefinite suspension. Not for a week. Not for a review period. Indefinite. Executives who once boasted about the show's resilience now whispered behind locked doors, afraid to even speak its name in meetings. HR departments began scrubbing internal memos. Legal advisors urged silence. No one wanted their name on anything tied to what had become a scorched earth scandal. The fallout wasn't just internal, it exploded across media like a wildfire. Joy Behar, who once seemed to thrive on headline feuds and bold sound bites, vanished overnight. No appearances, no tweets, no cryptic quotes leaked to friendly outlets. Just a sudden, eerie absence, as if she'd evaporated in the smoke of the trial's aftermath. Even gossip columns couldn't track her. Her publicist gave no comment. Her social media accounts went dark. And Whoopi Goldberg, whose name once anchored the brand itself, disappeared with equal force. Rumors swirled. She had fled to Europe. She was planning a tell-all. She had been advised by counsel to go completely silent, but none of it mattered. Because what did matter was the image that now defined her legacy, not of strength or sisterhood, but of folded arms and a carefully delivered insult. If it weren't for diversity initiatives, you wouldn't be sitting in that seat. That line had outlived the applause, and now it haunted everything she left behind. Sunny Hostin faced a different storm. While Joy and Whoopi receded into silence, Sunny was pulled directly into the spotlight, but this time, not on air. As a former federal prosecutor and legal analyst, her role in the segment took on deeper significance. It wasn't just cruelty, it was seen as betrayal from someone who should have known the line between commentary and character assassination. Days after the verdict, news broke that the New York Bar Association had launched an inquiry into her conduct. Whispers of disciplinary review became headlines. Former colleagues, once proud to cite her credibility, issued quiet statements of disappointment. Legal panels pulled her from guest slots. Firms distanced themselves. And what made it worse was that she had seen it coming. She had tried, however meekly, to exit the spiral before the trial even began. But Jasmine Crockett's reply to her private offer had been final. The pain I felt wasn't selective. Neither is the justice I'm seeking. And now Sunny was learning that truth in real time. Then came the advertisers. The exodus was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours of the jury's decision, 10 of the show's largest sponsors released statements, all using the same coded language. We are reevaluating our partnerships. But everyone knew what that meant. One by one, they pulled funding, not just from The View, but from ABC's broader daytime lineup. Luxury brands, tech giants, wellness companies, all fleeing a name now synonymous with strategic defamation. ABC's advertising department tried to salvage what they could, offering deep discounts, private assurances, and emergency rebranding plans. None of it worked. Because in the eyes of the public, the show wasn't just guilty in court, it was guilty on principle. Viewers who once laughed along were now posting clips in horror, dissecting frame by frame the moment Jasmine was set up and stripped of dignity in real time. Wall Street noticed. The network's parent company saw a 9% drop in stock value in under 48 hours, wiping out hundreds of millions in shareholder confidence. Financial analysts issued cold warnings. This may be unrecoverable in the short term. Media watchdogs declared it a turning point for daytime programming. News cycles that once celebrated The View as a cultural powerhouse now called it a cautionary tale. Commentators debated whether the show would ever return, and if it did, under what name, what hosts, and what soul. The answer wasn't clear, because the damage wasn't cosmetic, it was structural. Built into the DNA of a program that had, for too long, treated confrontation as entertainment and cruelty as content. Behind the scenes, ABC began triage operations. Crisis firms were hired overnight. Internal investigators were brought in to audit the communication chains. Who knew what, when, and who signed off on the pre-segment strategies that now lived in courtroom transcripts and national headlines. Staffers resigned. Others were reassigned. Producers scrubbed their LinkedIn pages. One mid-level executive reportedly walked out mid-meeting and never returned. The culture of untouchability that had defined the show was imploding, faster, louder, and more violently than anyone had anticipated. And all of it, every unraveling thread, traced back to one moment, the day they tried to humiliate a woman they never imagined would fight back and win. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. No press tour, no victory dance, no shouting on social media, because she had said what needed to be said where it mattered most, in court, on record, under oath. And the consequences were speaking for themselves. What had begun as 12 minutes of manipulated television had become a national reckoning. And now, in the ruins of a show once considered invincible, the industry had learned a new truth. When you manufacture pain for profit, don't be surprised when the bill finally arrives. The media storm exploded like wildfire across the country, drowning headlines with the collapse of The View, the silence of its stars, and the staggering $800 million verdict. But while news anchors speculated and social media danced in digital bonfires, there was one person who refused to celebrate. The courthouse doors groaned open as the crowd surged forward, pressing against barricades like ocean waves meeting steel. Reporters screamed questions from every angle, some desperate for sound bites, others just trying to capture her image. Flashbulbs burst against the overcast sky, flickering like lightning across Jasmine Crockett's face. But her stride never broke. Surrounded by her legal team, she descended the marble steps like a woman not escaping chaos, but walking straight through it, untouched. Her posture was steel, her expression unreadable. She wore no grin, no smirk, no expression of triumph, just the same determined calm that had carried her from the first insult to the final gavel. There was no podium, no waiting publicist, no official ABC mic flagged with a peacock logo. Just the open air of Washington, D.C., the city that had seen revolutions rise and reputations fall. The press expected a speech. They were practically begging for one. Dozens of cameras panned simultaneously. You could hear producers in the background whispering, "Get this live. Zoom tighter. She's going to say something." But she didn't raise her hands. She didn't hold a press release. She didn't even blink at the chaos. Instead, she paused midway down the steps, just long enough that every camera focused and every reporter hushed, sensing that something was about to be said. And in a voice clear enough to slice through wind and whispers alike, Jasmine Crockett spoke only 9 words. "I didn't retaliate. I reclaimed my dignity." That was it. No list of grievances, no scorched earth attack, no celebration. Just a line carved so cleanly into the moment it seemed to silence the air itself. It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict of her own, a final word that said more than any headline could. She didn't raise her voice, but it echoed off the courthouse columns, bounced through camera feeds, and landed like a stone in the gut of a nation watching. Because in that one sentence, the public saw the full measure of what had just happened. They saw that this wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration, about someone who had been mocked on live television, set up by a team of producers who saw her pain as entertainment, and yet chose to fight not with venom, but with truth. Jasmine hadn't come to humiliate anyone. She had come to defend something that had been stripped from her in front of millions. Respect. Behind her, the hosts of The View did not emerge. They remained hidden, shuttled out through underground garages and side exits like ghosts leaving the ruins of a crumbling cathedral. They had nothing to say. Not yet. Their silence was not principled. It was strategic. Legal teams were still reeling. Public relations advisors still writing drafts of statements that would never match the weight of 9 words. Jasmine descended the final steps. A child standing in the crowd, no older than 12, tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed. "She didn't yell," he whispered. "She didn't even look mad." The mother looked down, then back up at the figure disappearing into the waiting black SUV. "That's what strength really looks like," she answered. "It doesn't need to yell." Inside the vehicle, Jasmine sat without a word. Her lawyer offered her a water bottle. She didn't take it. She was still staring forward, not at the crowd, not at the courthouse, but at something far beyond either. For her, the fight hadn't ended with the verdict. The real work, she knew, had only just begun. But the court had given her something that could never be bought, never staged, and never edited in post-production. Truth, sealed by the law, watched by millions, and carried on by everyone who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. In the hours that followed, her sentence was everywhere. Major news outlets plastered it across headlines. "I didn't retaliate. I reclaimed my dignity." Opinion columns dissected its tone. Social media turned it into hashtags. Protesters wrote it on signs. Young activists printed it on shirts. And somewhere in a quiet apartment far from the coast, a woman who had been laughed at in her own workplace paused her day, looked up at the screen, and whispered those words to herself like a prayer. But Jasmine didn't see any of it. She turned off her phone. She didn't check trending topics. She didn't respond to celebrity praise or political endorsements. Because this wasn't about performance, it never had been. It wasn't about ratings or vindication or career moves. It was about showing that the line between truth and spectacle still mattered, that the pain of Black women wasn't a punchline, That silence in the face of systemic disrespect was no longer the cost of admission to the table. And though she had delivered those 9 words for herself, their resonance traveled faster than she could have imagined. Legal scholars replayed the clip in law schools. Commentators who once dismissed her now cited her as the voice of a new era of accountability. Even critics found themselves disarmed, not because they agreed with everything she stood for, but because they could no longer deny what had been done to her. Still, Jasmine didn't change her tone. No media tour, no expose. She politely declined interviews with every major outlet that requested a one-on-one. She had said what needed to be said, and now her silence was not retreat. It was a reminder that justice isn't always loud, that it doesn't always come dressed in anger or flashbulbs. Sometimes it arrives wearing quiet resolve and leaves with only dignity in its hands. In the days that followed, some tried to bait her into more. Rival hosts offered her airtime. Book agents came with contracts. Late-night comedians tried to spin her quote into comedy. She declined them all, because Jasmine Crockett knew something they didn't. Sometimes walking away with your head held high is the most defiant act of all. And when the dust began to settle and the studio lights dimmed for good, her words still echoed, not just in courtrooms or headlines or speeches, but in the places power doesn't reach. In classrooms, living rooms, shelters, clinics, anywhere someone had ever been dismissed, diminished, or demeaned. They heard her, they saw her, and most importantly, they understood her. Because in the end, she had not burned anyone down. She had simply refused to bow. Jasmine Crockett didn't demand the world change. She simply showed what happened when it didn't, and in doing so, forced the world to reconsider its reflection. The verdict had barely settled before television executives across the country scrambled to their boardrooms like generals after a failed campaign. Legal departments were summoned at midnight. Crisis consultants were flown in from opposite coasts. Showrunners who once mocked behind closed doors now whispered terms like defamation liability and public interest scrutiny, as if speaking them too loudly might invite subpoenas through their glass doors. The era of punchline first, accountability later was over, and Jasmine Crockett had closed the curtain with one sentence and a courtroom thunderclap that was still echoing down cable news corridors. Morning shows that once thrived on ambush segments began re-editing upcoming broadcasts overnight. Bookers started attaching clauses to contracts acknowledging the guest's right to full review. Network hosts, once invincible behind prompters and laughter tracks, now sat in post-production sessions with lawyers dissecting every off-the-cuff jab. You could feel the change not in words but in fear, and not the fear of controversy, but the fear of consequence. The industry had played with fire for years. Jasmine made sure the burns were visible. One executive at a leading network reportedly stood during a closed-door emergency meeting and said, "If we want gladiator fights, let's pay for helmets. If we want honesty, let's stop aiming for blood." The silence that followed wasn't disagreement. It was understanding. Jasmine's lawsuit hadn't just hit The View. It had drawn a line in the sand and dared every host in America to test their balance on it. Producers at long-running political roundtables began consulting with civil rights attorneys before drafting segment questions. Contracts were redrafted with new language forbidding coordinated ambush strategies or planned character breakdowns. In a matter of weeks, phrases like vulnerability protocol and integrity guest standard became regular terms of network policy. For the first time in decades, television hosts were being trained in something beyond delivery and timing. They were being trained in restraint. A late-night satire program, notorious for baiting its guests into moments of emotional collapse, quietly canceled 2 planned interviews with lesser-known political figures. In a leaked internal email, a producer admitted, "We can't afford another Jasmine Crockett moment. If we push too hard and they've got receipts, we're toast." The memo spread like wildfire across newsroom Slack channels. The term Jasmine Crockett moment became shorthand not for failure, but for reckoning. The most dramatic shift, however, wasn't inside boardrooms. It was inside households. Americans, especially older viewers, began demanding a different kind of programming. Letters poured into networks, thousands at a time, calling out tone, imbalance, and cruelty veiled as curiosity. Veterans wrote in about how they'd been dismissed by anchors on national TV. Teachers recounted segments where they were used as political props. Activists, once laughed off the stage, now reminded networks of their duty not just to ratings, but to truth. One media watchdog organization reported that guest complaints across live programming had tripled in a single month. But unlike previous years, those complaints were no longer ignored. Every recorded insult was now a liability. Every mocking montage, a potential lawsuit. Jasmine had walked through fire and left behind a legal precedent hot enough to melt decades of network impunity. Lawsuits that had long remained buried beneath NDAs and confidentiality agreements began resurfacing. A journalist in Chicago reopened a case involving a 2018 segment where a grieving mother was misrepresented as unstable. In Los Angeles, a former teacher filed suit over a panel show that manipulated her words to suggest racial insensitivity, words she never actually said. Jasmine's win wasn't just symbolic, it was kinetic. It gave the silenced a blueprint, and they followed it, filing motions with screenshots, recordings, text messages, and transcripts. Receipts of every time dignity had been traded for ratings. Behind the scenes, veteran anchors began declining the gotcha segments. One longtime TV personality reportedly told her staff, "I want to ask real questions, not set traps. If my job depends on humiliation, I'll find another job." Her words circulated internally and eventually leaked. By week's end, she wasn't fired. She was promoted to executive producer. But the real shift arrived when a new generation of guests began entering studio buildings, no longer afraid. They came armed, not with hostility, but with expectation. Expectation that their stories wouldn't be reduced to edits, that their truths wouldn't be sliced for commercial breaks, that they weren't walking into an ambush, but into a conversation. And if they weren't granted that respect, they were prepared to walk out or sue. And so it happened. Talk shows, once addicted to adrenaline, began restructuring, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. A major broadcast company unveiled a guest-first initiative mandating transparency in how interviews were planned and edited. Public editors, once ceremonial roles, were now empowered to intervene if guests raised objections post-broadcast. A new department at one streaming giant was formed solely to investigate complaints of guest manipulation. And in a move that stunned the industry, one prominent panel show paused its season mid-run and publicly apologized to 3 guests from previous years, inviting them back, not for redemption, but for reparation. The message was clear. If you lie on camera, edit for shame, or bait your guests for clout, you may just meet them in court. Jasmine hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't demanded a crusade, but her name became a turning point, an invisible clause every producer now whispered before writing a segment script. She hadn't destroyed the industry. She had simply dared it to do better. And beneath it all, beneath the reforms and apologies and rushed legal trainings, there lingered a quiet fear, not of lawsuits, not even of reputation, but of one person, a woman who hadn't raised her voice, hadn't launched a press tour, hadn't gloated. She had just told the truth and watched the walls crumble around it. And as the cameras turned elsewhere, networks restructured and the headlines faded from red to black, one truth remained suspended in the silence Jasmine left behind. A truth that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with dignity. In the end, what Jasmine Crockett won wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was a moral referendum, not on her, but on a culture that had forgotten the price of public humiliation. She didn't walk out of that courthouse with fanfare or vengeance. There were no celebrations, no champagne, no sound bites crafted to go viral. She walked out with something far heavier, a lesson that echoed across institutions, industries, and living rooms. A lesson about respect and what happens when we treat it as expendable. For decades, the architecture of modern television rewarded ridicule. Humor at someone else's expense was called edgy. Interruption was framed as engagement. Guests, especially women of color, were not welcome. They were set up. Every raised eyebrow, every smirk, every carefully timed cut to commercial became part of a formula. One that turned discomfort into spectacle. one that praised a host's quick wit while cutting the mic of those who dared speak truth to power. Jasmine didn't shatter that system with fury. She dismantled it with restraint. Her lesson began the moment she chose not to clap back on air, even as insults rained down. Not because she lacked words, but because she understood that some battles aren't won in the moment, they're won in memory. And when she sat, composed and silent, while America watched her dignity mocked in real time, she planted a seed in every viewer's conscience. What if that were me? The lesson deepened when she refused private settlements cloaked in fake apologies, when she said no to hush money disguised as reputational repair, when she stood alone while producers, executives, and publicists tried to cloak an orchestrated ambush in the language of misunderstanding. Jasmine's stand wasn't a rejection of entertainment. It was a demand that we redefine what we call entertainment, and who gets hurt in the process. Too often, we're taught that justice is about triumph, that the one who yells the loudest wins, that whoever lands the last joke, the final punchline, the most viral clip is the one who owns the story. Jasmine taught us something more uncomfortable, more enduring, that real justice might be quiet, that it might look like walking out alone, without applause, simply because you refuse to be broken. And in doing so, she offered a mirror, not just to The View, not just to ABC, but to us, to every audience member who once laughed when someone was cut off, to every producer who booked guests not to understand them, but to corner them, to every viewer who thought conflict made for better ratings than resolution. Jasmine didn't just sue a show, she indicted a mindset. Her courtroom win marked the beginning of a wider human reckoning. That speech, no matter how controversial, deserves fairness. That platform does not equal permission to belittle. That diversity is not a checklist for optics, but a commitment to listening, especially when it's uncomfortable. She reminded the world that being invited to speak means nothing if the room is rigged to drown you out. In interviews months later, she didn't dwell on the money or the headlines. Instead, she spoke about her late grandmother, who once told her that silence in the face of mockery isn't weakness, it's witness. That standing tall when you're being laughed at sends a louder message than shouting ever could. Jasmine made that memory real, for millions of viewers, for future guests, and for hosts now forced to reckon with the power they wield. But perhaps the most human lesson of all wasn't about rights or lawsuits or even race. It was about dignity, that no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to strip another person of their basic humanity under the glow of studio lights. That if we applaud cruelty, we inherit its consequences, and that every moment of televised mockery becomes not just a segment, but a stain. Jasmine Crockett walked into that studio expecting discussion. She left with scars, and yet she never called herself a victim. She called herself a witness to what happens when people confuse entertainment with entitlement. And because she stood her ground, quietly, firmly, legally, an entire system was forced to step back and ask itself, when did we start confusing cruelty with courage? That's the legacy she left. Not a verdict, but a voice. Not a fight, but a framework. Not revenge, but restoration. And now in green rooms across the country, guests ask for full context. Lawyers scan scripts. Hosts think twice. Not because they fear a lawsuit, but because they remember her face, her silence, and that moment when a woman who was mocked for her presence owned the room by refusing to play their game. That is the power of principle. That is the weight of humanity when it is not surrendered. And that is the lesson the world can no longer ignore. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.